for today, we have two questions. Let's bring up the first one. Somebody from YouTube asks, are there laws that need to be passed to enable more worker co-ops to be formed? And should that be another front for labor to organize on? So this is a good question. Paul, you are usually going off about unions. What about co-ops?
Right. So yeah, I mean, worker co-ops or cooperatives are essentially employee-owned companies, which can take the form of workers being members of like an employee stock ownership plans. And the idea is that these co-ops would gradually challenge and overtake capitalist firms and be able to usher in a socialist economy. And while I'm not entirely dismissive of the positive roles worker co-ops can play, I don't think it's a viable strategy for socializing the economy or building up the power of workers within capitalism. Worker co-ops within the capitalist system essentially mean that those workers become their own capitalists. They have ownership rights, they mobilize their own finances, they reinvest their surplus for their own advantage, and they are still forced to compete in the capitalist marketplace and with all the anti-social incentives that we as socialists know that entails. And we actually can look at some recent historical experiences that suggest that worker takeovers within a capitalist system don't always work out so well. So there was a wave of factory takeovers in Argentina after their 2001 financial crisis, and the government turned them into co-ops, and the workers took over firms that were saddled with debt and that they were now responsible for. And they wound up having to put their own savings into the company or accept lower wages to deal with the fact that these companies had to be competitive. There was also the Chicago Republic Windows and Doors example in 2008, which I think inspired a lot of the left, where workers occupied the factory and took it over to prevent it from closing. I mean, today, of the original 240 workers, only 17 remain. And due to competitive pressures, a lot of them pay themselves near or below the minimum wage. So I don't see any reason why worker co-ops can't easily be incorporated by the capitalist system. You know, a proliferation of worker-owned but still competing co-ops will not solve the problem of the need for massive economic planning in order to create a just society. And I think the enthusiasm for worker co-ops that pops up on the left from time to time comes from frustration and disillusionment with two things: the labor movement and the state. And I get it. The labor movement is in deep trouble. Unions right now may not seem like a viable vehicle for improving workers' lives. And with the state, the left entering and transforming the state is also very messy and difficult, and it throws up all kinds of challenges and contradictions. And so it feels to me like the emphasis on worker co-ops is kind of a way to sidestep these thorny questions. But unfortunately, you know, if we want to redistribute power and wealth to working people, there's no way we can sidestep them. Rebuilding the labor movement, whether in the form of reforming existing unions or organizing new workers, is a long-term commitment that won't bear fruit overnight. And as we saw with the recent Amazon result, we often ends in defeat. And the gains that are made in the labor movement and social movements need to be reflected in the state. We need to be able to win laws that change the balance of power in favor of workers and redistribute corporate profits to the public good, and have more working people coming out of these movements in the state. And this is all part of giving workers more say and control over the economy and society, which is part of what the idea of worker co-ops is to do anyway. And so even properly supporting existing and future worker co-ops, I think, requires big state action. So again, I don't want to be entirely dismissive. I think there can be a role for worker co-ops in the broader socialist movement. I think worker co-ops could, you know, lend facilities as cultural and political spaces for left movements, you know, like coffee shops, bookstores, bars, places for public forums. It's like impossible to find public meeting space anywhere. Or what if co-ops, you know, set aside for some of their revenue to help fund political organizing projects? But on its own, I don't think, you know, as a project of worker-owned firms that are still forced to compete in the market, I don't think it can be a central strategy to replace building the trade movement or taking on the state. So that's my take on the co-ops.
All right, Labor Paul coming in with a slightly contrarian take on worker co-ops. You got to remember you're talking to a union man through and through. So I
wish I could see the live chat, but there's probably a lot of thoughts. But I could generate more questions. So
indeed, yeah. If you have dissenting opinions, follow-up questions, please put them in the comments or the live chat, and perhaps Labor Paul will take them up next time. All right, let's move on to the next question. So another user from YouTube writes, didn't closed shop unions encourage even more discrimination? Please correct me if I'm wrong. Paul, this is 100% up your alley.
Yeah, and this actually gets back to something we covered on the show a while ago about the difference between an open shop and a closed shop. And so an open shop is a workplace where you are not automatically enrolled in the union as a product of being there. You'd have to voluntarily sign up to be in it. And a closed shop means that as soon as you become an employee, you are automatically part of the union. And so when this originally came up, I argue that even though some will say that having an open shop forces unions to organize better, I still think it's better overall to have closed shops. And having a closed shop doesn't prevent a union from doing good organizing. And now what I think this listener is getting at, and I apologize if this is wrong, is discrimination in the building trades. And the employment structure is a little different there, but not necessarily because it's a closed shop. You have closed shops in other elements of the private sector as well. But I think this gets at an important point to cover. The building trades have a reputation for being discriminatory, and this history is kind of long and complicated. And to be clear, by building trades, I mean construction work like electricians, carpenters, iron workers, plumbers, etc. And so, this work is part of what the so-called skilled trades. And these workers were in unions of the American Federation of Labor, which for a long time had explicit policies forbidding Black people and women from being members of their unions. And in these unions, you need to join the union and complete an apprenticeship program to get the work. Now, even after many of these unions officially stopped discriminating, it was very hard for large numbers of people of color to break in. And the reason is that you have new workers being recruited out of the social circles of the existing set of workers. So the workers are recruiting their cousins, their friends, their sons, their nephews into the trades. And even if they are not deliberately discriminating, their social circle is likely to be white because our society has been and still is very segregated, and this kind of reproduces itself. And so what do we do about this? And first, I think we need to make sure we talk about this with a degree of nuance. With the trades, you're talking about many different unions, many different kinds of jobs, and each union is different in its history and the amount of diversity in their ranks. And this can also vary widely by location. So like in New York City, for example, the demographics of the trades are actually pretty diverse and representative of the city, not so much in other places. And I'm going to go to Bayard Rustin, who had a lot of interesting things to say about this. Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights activist. And his take was that, it's hard to advance affirmative action measures in a time of economic scarcity. And of course, we know this economic scarcity is manufactured, but when those existing members of the trades feel that their jobs are under threat, it's going to be harder to advance those measures. And I think this can only be addressed by vastly expanding the pool of employment or a massive jobs program that creates the need to bring more workers into these jobs and into these training programs and into these unions. So in other words, you can address this problem during a period of big economic growth. And in our vision, this growth is stimulated by the federal government and the public sector. And, there's a lot more to say on this, but I'll leave it at that. But to come back to the original question, I don't know. I don't think closed shops inherently lead to more discrimination. Again, I think your question was kind of targeted at the building trades. But, in general, closed shops apply to many private sector jobs and private sector unions that aren't just the building trades.
Thanks. Well said.
Yeah. The problem of labor is solved. And
exactly. Sorry, I was trying to think of whether I had anything smart or pithy to add on to that. But I think you covered it. I do think I guess I have sort of a follow-up question, and this is something we sort of get at on the show in a couple different ways pretty much all the time. But I do feel like, the labor movement historically has not been perfect, especially on issues of race. It isn't perfect now, but I still think it's worth saying that it is one of the most effective vehicles for ending discrimination or for ameliorating discrimination and for upward mobility for historically marginalized groups. Like, I just think I you know, and I'm not saying that, you know, the person who posed the question is countering any of that. But I do think it's always worth saying that, because I think that, you know, or at least much like we were saying earlier, there's a lot of talk about the ways in which the New Deal was imperfect or even bad, some people might say. I just think it's worth reiterating that.
Right. Yeah. You know, and just so people know, you know, when I was as an undergrad, I was involved in a campaign in Philly. Long story short, essentially, you know, revolved around discrimination in the trades. So, you know, it exists. It is a thing. But again, I think there needs to be just a lot of nuance there, because I think it gets to be this trope of like, oh, building trades, there's no Black workers in building trades. And it's just like, just look around, obviously, in one sense. And again, like, it can vary so much. But, you know, not to get too off on track, but an interesting thing Bear Rustin also wrote about is, you know, Nixon, if people have heard about the Philadelphia plan, he kind of tried to cynically use this issue to kind of divide labor and civil rights in the early 70s, where he put out this plan around, you know, we're going to attack discrimination in the building trades. Nixon, of all people, is doing this. But, you know, he did it in a way where it wasn't actually doing what would needed to be done. And Rustin's point was like, you can only do this, again, if you expand employment, if you actually have a massive jobs program that's going to hire more people and train more people. But Nixon was very clever about using this kind of as a cynical, like, wedge issue, you know. And again, I'm not saying if someone brings up discrimination in the trades, they're using it as a wedge issue, but you know, it's you know, complicated, and I think it has to be solved in the context of just a broader jobs program that is creating more, you know, more jobs for everyone.
Yeah, and I think what further complicates the issue is, you know, probably anybody watching the Jacobin Show is not bringing up discrimination within unions or within the building trades in a cynical way. But we know full well that there are members of the Democratic Party elite who are bringing that up in a cynical way. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. We've talked about it on the show. And so, yeah, again, like you said, just approaching the issue with like pretty high degree of nuance and kind of, you know, I guess holding what you said.
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul, for the great Labor Paul segment. Again, if anybody listening has any, you know, follow-up questions or any new questions that you want to send over to Paul, please feel free to put those in the chat or put them in the comments, and we will get
prepared for like 5 co-op questions next time. But,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the next episode will be all of the follow-up co-op questions. So on that note, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.